At 0200 hours on November 13th, 1943, Corporal Wade Garrett crouched in a waterlogged foxhole on the island of Bougainville, watching a Japanese bomber circle overhead like a vulture that refused to land. The sky was pitch black, a heavy velvet curtain that hid everything but the stars. Garrett couldn't see the enemy plane, but he could feel the vibration of it. The engines of the Japanese Betty bomber were unsynchronized, creating a distinctive rhythmic pulsing that ground into the nerves of every man on the island. It was Washing Machine Charlie, the nightly visitor that kept 10,000 Americans awake, terrified and helpless. Garrett gripped his rifle, his knuckles white, watching the searchlight beams sweep back and forth across the clouds, like desperate fingers grasping at smoke. Suddenly a beam caught a flash of silver. For a split second, the Japanese bomber was illuminated, a tiny moth caught in a flashlight beam. The anti-aircraft guns on the ground opened fire. Tracers raced up into the sky, red lines of fire stitching the darkness, but the Japanese pilot simply dipped his wing and slipped back into the shadows as easily as a man stepping out of a lit room. The firing stopped, but the engine drone continued. Then came the bomb. A 500-pound weapon fell from the invisible plane, accelerating as it picked up speed. It slammed into the fuel dump 300 yards away. The ground jumped. A massive fireball rolled up into the night, turning the darkness into a blinding orange noon. Garrett cursed into the mud. It was the same story every single night. The Japanese owned the dark. For the American forces in the Pacific, the night was not a time to rest. It was a time to die. During the day, the sky belonged to the United States. The Corsairs, the Hellcats, and the Lightnings ruled the sun. They were faster, tougher, and flown by pilots who were aggressively hunting the enemy. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the war flipped. The American fighters were blind. They relied on the Mark I eyeball. Human vision. And human vision is useless when you're flying at 300 miles per hour inside a cloud at midnight. The Japanese knew this. They switched their tactics. They stopped fighting fair fights in the daylight and started sending solitary bombers to harass the American airfields at night. They knew the Americans couldn't stop them. The Army Air Forces tried. They sent P-38 Lightnings up to patrol the darkness. It was a suicide mission. The pilots would take off into the ink-black void, straining their eyes until they saw spots. They would crash into mountains they couldn't see. They would fly into the ocean because they lost the horizon. And even if they didn't crash, they couldn't find the enemy. It was like trying to swat a fly in a dark closet with a rolled-up newspaper. You might get lucky once in a million swings, but mostly you just broke the furniture. The morale on the ground was cracking. There is nothing worse for a soldier than feeling helpless. They watched their friends die in their sleep, blown apart by bombs dropped by an enemy who was laughing at them. They needed a weapon that didn't just guess where the enemy was. They needed a weapon that could see in the dark. Major Cyrus Blackwell stood at the edge of the airfield as the sun set behind the mountains, watching the day fighters taxi back to their revetments. The Corsairs and Mustangs were coming home. Their pilots would head to the officers' club, drink beer, tell stories about their kills. The day shift was over, but for Blackwell, the workday was just starting. He was 32 years old, lean, with dark circles under his eyes that came from flying too many missions and sleeping too little. His fellow pilots called him Nighthawk. Not as a compliment, they meant it as a jab, a reminder that he was different, that he volunteered for the missions nobody else wanted, the night missions. Blackwell had flown 52 combat missions. He'd seen men die in every way imaginable. But there was one death he couldn't shake. Lieutenant Marcus Brennan, Mac, his best friend, his wingman, his brother in everything but blood. It had happened in the summer of 1942, Over the Solomon Islands, they'd been scrambled at night to intercept a Japanese bomber that was harassing the fleet. 2 P-38 Lightnings against the darkness. Blackwell had been on Mac's wing. They'd climbed into the black soup of the night sky, their instruments glowing faintly in the cockpit. No moon, no stars, just the endless void. Mac's voice had come over the radio, calm, professional. "I've got nothing, Si. Can't see a damn thing." "Stay on my wing," Blackwell had replied. "We'll make another pass." But Mac had gotten disoriented. The darkness does that. It takes away your sense of up and down, your sense of speed, your sense of where the Earth is. Blackwell had heard the change in Mac's engine tone first. The pitch rising, Mac was diving, fast. "Pull up, Mac, pull up!" "I can't see the horizon, I don't know which way is up." Then the scream, short, abrupt, cut off by the sound of metal tearing apart. Mac had flown straight into the side of a mountain at 300 miles per hour. Blackwell had circled the impact site, watching the flames on the hillside until his fuel gauge forced him to turn back. They'd found Mac's body 2 days later, what was left of it. That was the night Blackwell stopped trusting his eyes. That was the night he started believing in something else, something the old-school fighter jocks would laugh at. Technology. In early 1944, a rumor started spreading through the airfields of the South Pacific. The crates arrived first, massive wooden boxes that took up half the cargo hold of the transport ships. The ground crews pried them open with crowbars, expecting to find spare engines or maybe a new shipment of jeeps. Instead, they found parts for an airplane that looked like it had been designed by a mad scientist who had never seen a runway. When they finally bolted the pieces together on the tarmac, the pilots of the squadron gathered around to stare. They didn't gasp in awe. They scoffed. It was the Northrop P-61. The factory called it the Black Widow. The pilots called it a bus. It was huge. It wasn't a sleek single-seat fighter like the Mustang. It was the size of a medium bomber. It had a wingspan of 66 feet, wider than the B-25 Mitchell that bombed Tokyo. It sat on tricycle landing gear that looked strong enough to hold up a bridge. It had twin tail booms that stretched back like the prongs of a giant fork, and it was heavy. Fully loaded, it weighed over 30,000 pounds. To put that in perspective, a Wildcat fighter weighed about 7,000 pounds. The P-61 was 4 Wildcats welded together. It required a crew of 3 men to operate, a pilot, a gunner, and a mysterious third man called a radar observer who sat in a dark hole in the back. The whole thing was painted a glossy, shiny black that looked wet even when it was dry. The experts walked around the machine and shook their heads, the hotshot fighter aces who lived for speed and turning battles. They kicked the tires, they looked at the massive greenhouse canopy, they laughed. "Does it come with a stewardess?" one of them asked. "Maybe it has a dining car," another replied. They told the new crews that this thing was a flying bathtub. They said it would turn like a dump truck. They said that if you took this lumbering beast into a dogfight with a Japanese Zero, you wouldn't just lose, you would be embarrassed before you died. The criticism wasn't just about the size. It was about the philosophy. Fighter pilots were lone wolves. They trusted their eyes and their hands. The P-61 demanded that they trust a box of vacuum tubes. The nose of the plane wasn't filled with guns or engines. It was filled with the SCR-720 radar, a fiberglass cone that housed a spinning dish antenna. The engineers claimed this dish could send out invisible waves, bounce them off an enemy plane miles away, and display the location as a blip on a tiny green screen. To the old-school pilots, this was science fiction nonsense. They didn't trust electronics. Radios broke all the time. Engines failed. Now the army wanted them to fly blind, ignoring their instincts and do whatever the nerd in the back seat told them to do. It was insane. It was a violation of everything they had learned in flight school. They looked at the P-61 crews with a mix of pity and contempt. They called them night witches. They bet money on how long it would take for the Black Widow to end up as a smoking pile of scrap metal at the end of the runway. But Major Cyrus Blackwell didn't care about the jokes. He walked around his P-61, which he had named Phantom's Breath. He ran his hand over the cold black aluminum. He knew something the aces didn't. He knew that the war had changed. Speed didn't matter if you couldn't find the target. Agility didn't matter if you were blind. Blackwell looked at the armament. The experts mocked the plane's weight, but they ignored why it was heavy. The belly of the P-61 was packed with 4 20mm cannons. These weren't machine guns, they were artillery pieces. A single hit from a 20mm could tear a wing off a bomber, and sitting on top of the fuselage like a crown was a powered turret with 4 50-caliber machine guns. The pilot could lock the turret forward, giving him 8 guns firing at once. Or the gunner could spin it around to shoot at enemies attacking from the rear. It was a flying battleship. Blackwell climbed up the ladder into the cockpit. It was a long climb. He settled into the seat, which sat high above the ground, giving him a view like he was driving a truck. He looked at the instrument panel. It was cluttered with dials, switches, and glowing red lights. He put on his headset and clicked the intercom. "Numbers, you there?" A voice crackled in his ear. Calm, precise. "Right here, Major. Scope is warming up." Lieutenant Silas Crane, 27 years old, a former electrical engineer from MIT, the kind of man who could build a radio from spare parts and explain quantum mechanics over breakfast. The other pilots called him Numbers because he saw the world in equations and probabilities. Blackwell trusted him more than he trusted his own eyes. "How's it looking back there?" Blackwell asked. "Clean sweep on the scope," Crane replied. "But give me another minute. The tubes need to heat up." Outside, the sun was setting. The shadows were stretching across the airfield. The Corsairs and Mustangs were landing, taxiing to their revetments to sleep. But for Blackwell and the Black Widow crews, the real work was about to begin. There was one problem, though: the paint. When the P-61 first arrived, the Army had painted it matte black. The logic seemed sound. If you want to hide in the dark, you paint yourself the color of the dark. They used a rough, flat paint that swallowed light, but in practice, it was a disaster. When a Japanese searchlight hit the matte paint, the rough surface grabbed the light and scattered it. The plane didn't disappear. It glowed. It looked like a white moth caught in a flashlight beam. The invisible plane stood out like a sore thumb. Blackwell and the ground crew didn't wait for a solution from the factory. They went to the chemical supply depot. They realized that they didn't need the paint to absorb the light. They needed it to deflect the light. They needed the plane to be a mirror, not a sponge. If the surface was perfectly smooth and glossy, the searchlight beam would bounce off it at an angle and disappear into the darkness, leaving the plane unseen. It was counterintuitive. You don't wear shiny clothes to hide. But physics didn't care about intuition. The ground crews got to work. They scrubbed the planes down. They waxed them. They polished the black paint until you could see your face in it. They turned the rough, flat beasts into glossy black phantoms. When they tested it, the results were shocking. A P-61 could fly right through a searchlight beam, and unless the beam hit it at a perfect 90-degree angle, the plane remained almost invisible. The light just slid off the skin. The flying bathtub had become a stealth fighter. Now equipped with a magic eye and an invisible cloak, Blackwell and Crane took Phantom's Breath out for training missions. The learning curve was brutal. Blackwell had to learn a new language: vectors, angels, bogies. He had to practice ground-controlled intercepts where a radar operator on the ground would guide him close to a target, and then the plane's own radar would take over for the final stalk. He flew practice missions against American bombers, creeping up behind them in the dark until he was close enough to see the exhaust flames. He learned that the radar had a blind spot directly above and below, so he had to approach from the same altitude. He learned that rain clouds created ghosts on the screen that looked like planes. He had to learn the difference between a thunderstorm and a Betty bomber just by looking at the fuzziness of a green dot. But the hardest part wasn't the radar, it was the trust. Fighter pilots were used to being masters of their own destiny. They trusted their eyes. Now Blackwell was flying 300 miles per hour through pitch-black clouds, unable to see the wingtips of his own plane, while a voice in his ear told him to turn left, climb 500 feet, or slow down. It required a level of trust that went against every survival instinct a pilot had. It was like driving a race car blindfolded while a passenger shouted directions. But Blackwell thought of Mac, and he knew that trust was the only way forward. The skepticism from the other pilots continued. They watched Blackwell and the other P-61 crews prepare for their night patrols. They saw the lumbering black beasts taxi out to the runway. They shook their heads. "They won't come back," one of them muttered. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, Blackwell sat in the cockpit of Phantom's Breath, running through his pre-flight checklist. Behind him, Crane was buried under a blackout curtain, his face pressed into the rubber hood of the radar scope. The green sweep lines spun around and around, painting a picture of the empty sky. In the rear compartment, Sergeant Dante Torres checked the ammunition belts feeding into the top turret. Everything was ready. Blackwell looked out at the darkening sky. He knew the Japanese bombers were out there. He knew Washing Machine Charlie was warming up his engines, preparing to terrorize the ground troops again. He watched the skepticism on the faces of the ground crew as they pulled the chocks from the massive wheels. They didn't think he would come back. They thought this monster was too heavy to fly and too complicated to fight. Blackwell started the engines. The twin Pratt and Whitney double Wasps surged to life, 2,000 horsepower per side. The blue flames from the exhaust stacks flickered in the twilight. The plane shook, a deep, heavy vibration that felt like an earthquake. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of a fighter, it was the low, angry growl of a predator. Blackwell released the brakes. The invisible giant began to roll. He pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared, the runway lights blurred past, the nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. 30,000 pounds of doubt climbed into the sky, and as the darkness swallowed the black plane, Blackwell keyed the mic. "Numbers, how's the scope?" Crane's voice came back, steady and calm. "Clear as glass, Major. We're ready to hunt." Blackwell smiled for the first time in weeks. The night didn't belong to the enemy anymore. It belonged to the invisible giant. 30,000 pounds of doubt climbed into the darkness, carrying 3 men and a promise. Tonight, they would prove that the future of war wasn't about speed or agility. It was about the one who could see when everyone else was blind. The sky inside the P-61 was a different world than the sky outside. Outside, it was a terrifying void of wind and darkness where mountains waited to kill you and the ocean was a black grave. Inside the cockpit, it was a glowing cave of red instrument lights and the steady drone of the intercom. Blackwell leveled off at 10,000 feet over Saipan. He dimmed the cockpit lights until they were barely aglow. He wanted his eyes as adjusted to the dark as possible. Behind him, under a blackout curtain, Crane buried his face in the rubber hood of the radar scope. The green sweep lines spun around and around, painting a picture of the empty sky. For an hour, there was nothing. Just the drone of the engines and the static in the headset. It was boring, lonely work. It felt less like flying a fighter and more like driving a delivery truck on an empty highway at 3 in the morning. Then the radio came to life. "Black Widow, this is ground control, bogey detected. Vector 270, Angels 8, distance 15 miles. Blackwell felt the adrenaline hit his system like a shot of caffeine. He banked the massive plane to the west. "Contact," Crane said from the back. His voice was calm, flat, professional. "I have a target 12 miles out. Lower and to the left, moving 200 knots. Looks like a Betty." Blackwell couldn't see a thing. The windshield was a black square. He was flying entirely on instruments. "I'm blind up here, numbers. Talk me in." "Turn left 10 degrees, Crane instructed. "He's moving fast but steady. Doesn't know we're here." Blackwell made the correction and pushed the throttles forward. The P-61 surged. This was the moment the experts had laughed at. They said the plane was too heavy. But gravity works for you when you have 4,000 horsepower. The Black Widow ate up the distance. 10 miles, Crane said. 8 miles, 5 miles. Target is steady. We're closing. 4 miles. He doesn't see us. This was the terrifying part of the intercept. The P-61 was closing on the enemy at a speed difference of over 100 miles per hour. If they messed up the timing, they wouldn't shoot the bomber, they would ram it. A mid-air collision in the dark would kill everyone instantly. Blackwell had to slow down. He dropped the flaps slightly. He eased back on the throttles. He crept up on the target like a cat stalking a mouse. 2 miles, Crane said quietly. 1 mile. Look for exhaust. Blackwell strained his eyes against the darkness. He looked for the blue flicker of engine exhaust. He looked for a silhouette blocking the stars. Nothing. Just the void. He felt a bead of sweat roll down his neck. His hands were gripping the yoke so hard his fingers hurt. He was trusting his life to a green dot he couldn't see. "Half mile," Crane said. "Slow down. You're coming in hot." And then Blackwell saw it. It wasn't a shape at first. It was just a patch of sky where the stars were missing. A black hole moving against the background of the universe. As he got closer, the black hole resolved into a shape. The thick wings, the cigar-shaped fuselage, the twin engines. It was a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber. It was cruising along, fat and happy, loaded with bombs intended for the Marines sleeping below. The Japanese pilot had no idea that a 30,000-pound monster was sitting right behind his tail. Blackwell checked his switches. He flipped the master arm toggle. He selected the 4 20mm cannons in the belly. He crept closer. 500 yards, 400 yards. He could see the gun turrets on the Japanese bomber. He could see the pilot's head moving in the cockpit. "I have visual," Blackwell said. "Tally-ho." "Clear to fire," Crane confirmed. Blackwell put the illuminated pipper of his gun sight right on the left-wing root of the bomber, exactly where the fuel tanks were. He took a breath. He squeezed the trigger. The effect of 4 20mm cannons firing at once was physical. The plane shuddered as if it had hit a brick wall. The sound was a massive, mechanical roar that drowned out the engines. Streams of high-explosive incendiary shells erupted from the belly of the Black Widow. They crossed the dark space in an instant. They didn't just sparkle on the enemy plane, they butchered it. The shells smashed into the left wing of the Betty. There was a flash of white light, and then the wing simply separated from the fuselage. It sheared off, tumbling away into the night. The fuel tanks ignited. A massive fireball erupted, illuminating the ocean below for miles. The Japanese bomber entered a violent spin, trailing a comet's tail of burning gasoline. Blackwell hauled back on the yoke, pulling the Black Widow up and away from the debris. He watched the fire fall. It hit the water with a massive cloud of steam. "Splash one," Blackwell said, his voice shaking. "Good kill," Crane replied. "Scope is clear. Let's find another one." They landed an hour later. The ground crew swarmed the plane, smelling the cordite smoke that lingered around the gun barrels. Blackwell climbed down the ladder. His legs felt like jelly. He had just killed 5 or 6 men, and he had done it without them ever knowing he was there. It wasn't a dogfight, it was an assassination. The word spread fast. The flying bathtub worked. It wasn't a joke anymore. The other pilots looked at the Black Widow with a new kind of respect. It was ugly, it was heavy, and it was weird, but it was a killer. The Marines on the ground slept a little better that night, knowing that the giant was awake. But the Japanese weren't stupid. They noticed that their bombers weren't coming back. They noticed the wreckage washing up on the beaches. They realized that the Americans had found a way to see in the dark. And the Japanese Empire wasn't going to give up the night without a fight. They had their own aces, they had their own fast planes, and they began to send out something new. Not slow bombers, but hunters. Fast, agile night fighters designed to find the Black Widow and kill it. A week later, Blackwell and Crane were up again. The radar scope glowed green, but this time the blip wasn't moving slow and straight. It was moving fast, and it was turning. It was coming right at them. "Contact," Crane said, and this time there was tension in his voice. "Target is closing high speed. He's on an intercept course." Blackwell gripped the stick. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The radar blip on Crane's screen wasn't just a glowing green dot anymore, it was a predator. The Japanese night fighter, likely a Nakajima J-1N Irving, was closing at over 300 miles per hour. This wasn't a clumsy bomber stumbling around in the dark. This was a twin-engine hunter designed specifically to kill American intruders. It was faster than the Black Widow in a straight line, and it was lighter. If this turned into a turning fight, a dogfight, the laws of physics said the 30,000-pound American plane should lose. Blackwell pushed the throttles past the detent, engaging the war emergency power. The Pratt & Whitney engines responded with a violent surge. The water injection system kicked in, spraying a mist of water and alcohol into the cylinders. The horsepower jumped from 2,000 to 2,200 per engine. The Black Widow leapt forward, its exhaust stacks spitting blue flames. But the Japanese pilot pushed harder. The gap on the radar screen stayed steady. He wasn't shaking him. The Japanese pilot had the advantage of position. He was high and behind, diving down into the Black Widow's 6 o'clock. He could see the dark silhouette of the massive American plane against the ocean below. He didn't need radar. He had a target the size of a barn door. He lined up his sights. He placed his finger on the trigger of his 20mm cannons. He expected the American pilot to do what all bomber pilots did: dive and pray. He expected the target to be sluggish, heavy, and helpless. He was wrong. The P-61 had a secret hidden in its wings. Most planes used ailerons, flaps on the trailing edge of the wing, to bank and roll. But the P-61 needed its entire trailing edge for massive landing flaps to carry its immense weight. So the engineers at Northrop had installed spoilerons. These were long, thin metal plates that popped up out of the top of the wing, destroying the lift on that side. It was a violent, jagged way to fly. When Blackwell kicked the stick hard to the left, he didn't just bank, he snapped the plane over. The spoileron on the left wing punched into the airstream, dumping lift instantly. The giant black plane rolled with the speed of a fighter, half its size. It didn't wallow, it snapped. Blackwell pulled back on the yoke, dragging the nose around in a tight, punishing turn that crushed the crew into their seats. The G-forces hit them like a physical blow. The airframe shuddered under the stress, thousands of rivets straining against the aluminum skin, but the plane held together. The Japanese pilot, expecting a slow, lumbering target, suddenly found himself shooting at empty air. The Black Widow had stepped aside like a matador, letting the bull rush past. The Irving shot past them, its tracers drawing useless lines in the darkness. Now the positions were reversed, but only for a second. The Japanese pilot was good. He pulled up into a vertical climb, using his lighter weight to loop over the top, trying to drop back down on Blackwell's tail. It was a classic move. He was trading speed for altitude, preparing to hammer the Americans from above. Blackwell couldn't follow him up. The P-61 was too heavy to win a climbing contest. If he tried to hang on the prop, he would stall and fall out of the sky like a brick. But Blackwell didn't need to point the nose at the enemy to kill him. He had something the Japanese didn't have. He had a sting in his tail. "Gunner, take the turret," Blackwell shouted. In the rear compartment, Sergeant Dante Torres unlocked the General Electric turret mounted on top of the fuselage. This was a technological marvel, a dome of steel and glass housing 450 caliber machine guns. Usually it was locked forward so the pilot could use it like a chainsaw, but with the flip of a switch, control passed to the gunner. Torres grabbed his sighting handles. The turret rotated with a mechanical grind, turning to face the rear. The Japanese pilot came over the top of his loop, diving back down. He thought he had the American plane dead to rights. He saw the twin tail booms. He saw the cockpit glass. He started to squeeze his trigger again. Wheeze. He never saw the 4 black barrels swivel toward him. Torres pressed the firing studs. The turret fired. The sound inside the P-61 was deafening, a percussive hammer pounding directly into the skull. 4 streams of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds poured backward up into the face of the diving Japanese fighter. It was a wall of light, dense and inescapable. The Japanese pilot flew face first into the storm. The heavy bullets smashed through his canopy. They shredded his engine cowlings. They turned his propeller blades into twisted scrap. The Irving didn't just catch fire, it stopped flying. The kinetic energy of the impact was so massive that pieces of the Japanese plane were ripped off and flung backward. The enemy fighter tumbled past the Black Widow, a burning wreck spinning down toward the water. It hit the ocean a few seconds later. A brief, violent impact that was swallowed by the night. "Splash 2, Torres said. His voice was tight, breathless. Blackwell leveled the plane. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He checked the engine gauges. Everything was in the green. They were alive, but the night wasn't over. Vector 180, ground control transmitted. "We have a convoy of barges moving supplies near the coast. Can you investigate?" Blackwell turned the invisible giant south. This was the versatility of the Black Widow. It wasn't just a fighter. It was an attack platform. They dropped down to 1,000 feet, skimming the tops of the waves. The radar could pick up ships just as easily as it could pick up planes. Crane adjusted the gain on his scope. The coastline of Saipan appeared as a jagged green line, and there, tucked into a cove, were 3 small blips. Japanese barges trying to sneak reinforcements onto the island under the cover of darkness. They thought they were safe. They thought the American planes couldn't see them. Blackwell lined up the approach. He didn't use the turret this time. He went back to the sledgehammer. The 4 20mm cannons in the belly. He armed the system. The plane vibrated as the hydraulic charging mechanism slammed the massive shells into the breaches. The barges were running without lights, dark shapes against the dark water. Blackwell flew purely on Crane's instructions. "Target 12 o'clock, 1 mile, half mile. You should see them now." Blackwell peered through the armored glass. He saw the white wake of the lead barge. It was a small target, moving fast. He pushed the nose down, aiming slightly ahead of the wake. He pulled the trigger. The P-61 slowed down in mid-air from the recoil. The 4 cannons spit fire. High explosive shells slammed into the water, walking toward the barge. Then they connected. The wooden hull of the barge splintered. The ammunition stored on the deck detonated. A secondary explosion ripped the vessel apart, throwing burning crates and men into the air. Blackwell pulled up hard, banking away from the debris. He circled back. The other two barges were scattering, turning toward the beach. It was too late. The Black Widow was on them. Blackwell lined up the second barge. A 2-second burst. The barge disintegrated. He lined up the third. Another burst. The fuel drums on the deck ignited, turning the barge into a floating pyre. It was a massacre. But the violence of the night had a cost. As Blackwell pulled away from the burning barges, a searchlight from the shore flicked on. It swept the sky, hunting for the attacker. The beam caught the P-61. For a second, the glossy black paint did its job, deflecting the light. But the beam was too close, too intense. It locked on. Suddenly, the sky around them filled with flak. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners on the beach poured fire into the cone of light. Black puffs of smoke appeared around the plane. Shrapnel struck the aluminum skin like hail on a tin roof. A piece of steel punched through the floor of the cockpit, slicing through a bundle of wires. The instrument panel flickered. The radar screen in the back went dead. "I lost the scope," Crane yelled. "We're blind." Blackwell slammed the throttles forward, banking hard to escape the light. But the light followed him. He dove toward the water, hoping to lose the beam against the dark background of the ocean. The flak followed him down. A shell burst just off the right wing. The plane lurched violently. The right engine lost power completely. Blackwell fought the controls. The dead weight of the right engine dragged the wing down. The plane wanted to roll over and dive into the sea. He stomped on the left rudder pedal, using all his strength to keep the nose straight. He feathered the prop on the dead engine, turning the blades so they sliced through the air instead of dragging against it. They were at 500 feet, on one engine, blind and being shot at. The invisible giant was wounded. The magic eye was dead. The stealth cloak was gone. Now it was just a pilot and a broken machine trying to survive. "Give me a heading home," Blackwell shouted. "I can't," Crane yelled back. "The nav system is out. I have no radar. I can't see the coastline." Blackwell looked out the window. It was just black water and black sky. He had no horizon. His gyro compass was spinning lazily, broken by the flak. He didn't know which way was north. He didn't know where the airfield was. And he had a Japanese searchlight still probing for him, looking to finish the job. He had to rely on the one thing the experts had told him not to trust: his instincts. Blackwell looked up through the canopy. He saw the stars. He found the Southern Cross hanging low on the horizon. He knew the airfield was to the northeast. He banked the wounded plane, fighting the drag of the dead engine. He aimed the nose at a star, and he flew on feel. For 20 minutes they limped through the darkness. No one spoke. The only sound was the drone of the left engine and the wind whistling through the bullet holes in the fuselage. Blackwell listened to the sound of the good engine. He nursed the throttle, keeping the cylinder head temperatures down. He felt the vibration of the airframe, sensing when the plane was getting close to a stall. He was flying a 30,000-pound brick with one wing tied behind its back. In the back, Crane sat in silence, his useless radar screen dark. Torres checked and rechecked his ammunition, trying to stay calm. They trusted Blackwell completely. And Blackwell thought of Mac. "I won't fail them like I failed you," he whispered into the darkness. Then on the horizon a faint glow appeared, a rotating beacon. The airfield. But Blackwell didn't have enough power to circle. He had to land on the first pass. He dropped the landing gear. The hydraulic pump on the right engine was dead, so he had to use the emergency hand pump. He pumped the lever frantically, feeling sweat pour down his face until he felt the heavy thunk of the wheels locking into place. He lined up on the runway lights. He was coming in fast. Too fast. Without the drag of both props, the plane didn't want to slow down. He couldn't risk using full flaps with one engine out. The asymmetry would flip the plane over. He had to land hot. The runway rushed up to meet them. Blackwell cut the throttle. The Black Widow slammed onto the coral strip. The tires screamed. Rubber burned against the surface. Blackwell stood on the brakes. The massive plane shuddered, sliding, groaning, eating up the runway. The end of the strip was coming up fast. A cliff, a drop-off into the ocean. Blackwell held the brakes until he smelled burning rubber. The plane slowed, it skidded, and finally it stopped. The nose wheel was 5 feet from the edge of the cliff. The prop of the good engine spun down to a halt. Silence rushed back into the cockpit. Blackwell slumped in his seat. He was soaked in sweat. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't unbuckle his harness. He heard the canopy open above him. He heard the ground crew running toward the plane. They had gone out as a joke. They had come back as a wreck. But in between, they had cleared the sky. The ground crew rushed to the plane, their flashlights dancing over the black skin. They weren't cheering, they were silent, they were looking at the damage. The right wing looked like it had been chewed by a steel shark. The flak shell had punched a hole the size of a manhole cover through the aluminum skin. Inside the wing was a twisted mess of wires and tubing. Oil from the dead engine coated the fuselage in a thick, slick layer, dripping onto the runway like black blood. The propeller blades on the right side stood motionless against the night sky. It was a miracle the plane had flown at all. The hotshot fighter pilots walked out from the operations tent, the ones who had spent weeks making jokes about the flying bathtub. They didn't say a word. They walked up to the plane and ran their hands over the jagged holes. They looked at the soot stains on the gun ports where the cannons had fired. They looked at the empty shell casings that littered the floor of the cockpit. They realized that while they had been sleeping, this lumbering, ugly giant had gone out into the heart of the storm and taken a beating that would have disintegrated a Mustang or a Corsair. The mockery evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a quiet, reverent nod. The P-61 wasn't a joke anymore. It was a shield. The next morning, the intelligence reports came in, confirming what the radar screen had shown before it went dead. A Japanese Betty bomber had failed to return to its base. An Irving fighter had failed to return. The wreckage of the supply barges was washing up on the reef. But the most important result wasn't the tally of dead enemy planes. It was the silence. For the first time in months, the night over Saipan was quiet. Washing machine. Charlie didn't show up. The Japanese commanders, realizing that the darkness was no longer a sanctuary, grounded their nuisance bombers. They knew that something was waiting for them up there. Something they couldn't see, but that could see them perfectly. This was the true victory of the Black Widow. It wasn't just about shooting down planes, it was about psychological dominance. The Japanese pilots were brave, often to the point of fanaticism. They would fly into a wall of anti-aircraft fire without blinking, but there is a special kind of terror in fighting an enemy you cannot see. It's the fear of the dark, primal and deep. Knowing that a black monster might be stalking you, matching your speed, creeping into your blind spot, ready to unleash a sledgehammer of 20mm shells. That fear broke them. The night sky, once their playground, became a no-man's land. As the war pushed closer to Japan, the P-61 became the undisputed king of the midnight hour. It operated in the Philippines, in China, and over the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. It didn't just hunt bombers, it hunted everything. The crews got creative. They loaded the wings with rockets and bombs. They swept over Japanese airfields at night, using their radar to find parked planes and hangars. They became intruders, marauders who struck when the enemy was most vulnerable. The invisible giant also proved that it was tougher than anything else in the sky. Stories began to circulate about Black Widows flying through typhoons that grounded the rest of the Air Force. One P-61 crew flew into a tropical storm so violent it stripped the paint off the nose cone, yet they completed their patrol and landed safely. Another crew rammed a Japanese fighter in mid-air when their guns jammed, slicing the enemy plane in half with their wing. and flying home with a piece of the Japanese tail embedded in their leading edge. It was built like a tank, fought like an assassin, and flew like a spaceship. In May of 1945, over Okinawa, Blackwell had his finest night. The Japanese were making a last, desperate push, a formation of bombers laden with explosives heading for the American ships anchored off the coast. They flew in darkness, thinking they were safe, but Crane's radar screen lit up like a Christmas tree. "Multiple contacts," he said. "Bearing 090, Angels 10, 5, no, 6 targets." Blackwell's pulse quickened. "Let's go to work." For the next hour, Blackwell became death itself. Using the radar, he stalked the formation. One by one, he picked them off. The Japanese pilots never saw him. They only knew they were dying when the 20mm shells tore through their wings. 5 kills in a single night, a record. The bombs that had been meant for sleeping sailors and Marines fell harmlessly into the ocean, detonating in massive geysers of water. When Blackwell landed, the ground crew counted the empty shell casings. They looked at him with something close to awe. "Mac," Blackwell whispered to the night sky, "we won. We own the night now." On the ground, Corporal Wade Garrett, now a battle-hardened sergeant, slept peacefully for the first time in 2 years. He knew there was a guardian angel circling above. August 1945. The atomic bombs fell. Japan surrendered. The war was over. Blackwell survived. 12 night kills, 73 combat missions, 0 losses. He stood on the tarmac and looked at Phantom's breath. The glossy black paint, the scarred wings, the radar dome in the nose. He thought about all the men who had slept safely because of this ugly, beautiful beast. He wrote a letter to Mac's mother. "Your son's sacrifice led to every life I saved. He flew with me every night. He will fly with me forever." But peace brought a tragedy that felt worse than war. The jet age arrived with screaming turbines and supersonic speeds. The P-61, with its piston engines and propellers, became obsolete overnight. It was expensive to maintain, difficult to fly, complicated. The Air Force made a decision: scrap them all. Blackwell received orders to report to an airfield in the Arizona desert. When he arrived, he saw a sight that broke his heart. Hundreds of Black Widows parked in endless rows under the burning sun, and the bulldozers were already there. He watched as the guillotines dropped, chopping the tails off the planes. He watched as the crushers smashed the fuselages into twisted metal. The SCR-720 radars, once top secret, were ripped out and thrown into scrap piles. The aluminum was melted down for soda cans, for screen doors. The invisible giant didn't disappear into the dark. It disappeared into the smelter. Blackwell found Phantom's breath in the 3rd row. He climbed into the cockpit one last time. He sat in the seat. He touched the yoke. He looked at the instrument panel, now dark and dead. He remembered every star, every intercept, every life saved. He remembered the sound of Crane's voice in his ear, the vibration of the engines, the smell of cordite after a kill. He remembered 73 nights when he had been part of something larger than himself. "She saved my life 73 times, he whispered. "I couldn't save her once." And Major Cyrus Blackwell wept. Today, only 4 P-61 Black Widows exist in the entire world. None of them are flying. They sit in quiet museums. Their glossy black paint is dusty. Their tires are flat. Their radar screens are dark. Visitors walk past them, often mistaking them for bombers because of their size. They don't realize the terror these planes brought to the Japanese Empire. They don't see the technological marvel that saved thousands of Marines from sleepless nights. They just see an old weird airplane. But the legacy of the Black Widow lives on in every modern fighter jet, in the F-22 Raptor, in the F-35 Lightning, The DNA is there, radar, sensors, stealth. The P-61 proved that information is more lethal than speed, that seeing the enemy first is the only advantage that matters. The radar observer evolved into the weapons systems officer of the F-4 Phantom and the F-14 Tomcat. The glossy black paint was the ancestor of modern stealth coatings. The P-61 was the missing link between the Knights of the Air and the digital warriors of the future. Blackwell lived a long life after the war. He became a commercial pilot. He flew passengers across the country in comfort and safety. But he never forgot the vibration of those engines, the smell of the ozone from the radar, the sound of Crane's calm voice in the darkness. He visited the museum P-61s whenever he could. He would stand in front of them, an old man with tears in his eyes, and remember. In the summer of 2021, a very old man in a wheelchair was pushed up to a P-61 Black Widow in a museum in Ohio. Wade Garrett was 101 years old. His body was frail, but his eyes were still sharp. He reached up with a weathered hand and placed it on the glossy black fuselage. "Thank you, Nighthawk," he whispered. "I lived because you flew." But Wade Garrett wasn't the only one who remembered. In the autumn of 1997, an 85-year-old Cyrus Blackwell sat in his study holding a faded photograph. It was Mac, young, smiling, alive. On his desk lay a letter that had arrived that morning from Mac's younger sister. She had found the letter Blackwell had written to their mother in 1945. The one where he said, "Your son's sacrifice led to every life I saved." Her reply was simple. Mac would have been proud. You didn't carry guilt, you carried his legacy. You became the pilot he always believed you could be. Thank you for bringing him home every night. Blackwell read it 3 times, then he walked outside and looked up at the night sky. The stars were clear, the same stars he had used to navigate home on that terrible night in 45. He smiled, a real smile. For the first time in 55 years, the weight lifted. "We did it, Mac," he whispered to the darkness. "We owned the night, together." He died peacefully 1 year later, age 86, dreaming of green radar screens and his best friend's voice on the radio. The camera pulled back, showing the dusty plane in the empty museum. A small plaque on the wall read, "Guardian of Darkness, Savior of Thousands." The story of the P-61 is a reminder that innovation often looks ridiculous at first. The experts will always laugh at the new idea. They will call it too heavy, too complicated, too different. But in war and in life, the only thing that matters is what works. The Black Widow worked because it ignored the rules of the past and embraced the reality of the future. It taught us that you don't have to be the fastest or the prettiest to win. You just have to be the one who can see in the dark. So the next time you look up at the night sky, spare a thought for the invisible giant. Remember the crews who flew into ink-black storms with nothing but vacuum tubes to guide them. Remember the night witches who turned the mocking laughter of their peers into the silence of a safe airfield. And remember that sometimes the monsters hiding in the dark are actually the good guys. Today, only 4 Black Widows remain in the world. But every pilot who flies with radar, who trusts technology over instinct, who strikes from the shadows unseen, they are flying Cyrus Blackwell's legacy. The lesson of the Black Widow is simple. In war and in life, you don't need to be the fastest. You don't need to be the strongest. You just need to be the one who can see in the dark when everyone else is blind. 4 planes remain. But the invisible giant never truly died. It lives on every night, in every sky, watching over those who sleep safely below. Don't let them be forgotten.